Hello ladies and gentlemen, it's the Historical Gamer once again, and today I'm returning to play Order of Battle Pacific. We are returning to the Let's Play of my campaign game, playing as the Imperial Japanese Empire. And in the first two videos, this is the third video of the Battle of Midway. This isn't the third video of the series, we're much further into the war than that. But this is the third video that we're looking at the Battle of Midway scenario, and in the first video we defeated the American air attack on the Japanese fleet. We're playing as the Japanese. In the second video we sunk 3 American carriers, so we've utterly decimated the American carrier force, as well as decimating the American air arm. So at this point, sadly, this video is more or less just a... what do you call it? A mopping up operation. I assume this will be the last video in the Battle of Midway, and we'll find out what comes next. But with the 3 sunk American carriers and with the destroyed American air fleet, really at this point it's just a matter of taking the island and destroying what ships we can. It actually looks to be that the American ships look to be retreating to the east. After we sunk the last American carrier, it looks like the warships have orders to bug out, which is rather interesting. I don't think I've seen that in this game previously. You know, when you defeat enemy capital ships, the enemy fleet apparently retreats. That seems like a realistic response. I'm sure if all 3 American carriers were sunk, the response for the surface fleet would be, get the hell out of there and save yourself so we don't lose all of our cruisers and destroyers that we might need in later battles. Similar response to the way the Japanese responded to their own defeat at the historical Battle of Midway, although not exactly. It's interesting, when you look at the actual Japanese attack on Midway, you'd think once the 4 Japanese carriers are set ablaze and more or less destroyed, and the air wings are more or less destroyed, that the Japanese would immediately respond with retreat. But they did not, actually. Yamato, perhaps as an attempt to kind of pull a Lee, and what I mean by that is during the Battle of Antietam, General Lee had been more or less defeated on the field of battle. He had clung to his positions, but only barely, and had escaped a decisive defeat that could have been catastrophic for the Confederacy in that 1862 battle. But he had been all but defeated on the field of battle, except he refused to retreat. He stuck around the following day, basically inviting the Union to attack, and they did not. So he could sort of claim political victory, be like, well, they didn't drive us from the field, you know, we held the field the following day, and we withdrew on our own terms. And I wonder if maybe Yamato was doing the same thing at Midway, because after the Japanese warships, after the Japanese carriers were sunk, he continued giving orders to the surface fleet to continue advancing on Midway, to the consternation of some of his staff, actually. And throughout the remainder of the day, through into the night of the following night after the decisive defeat of the Japanese carriers, the Japanese warships were sailing east, and actually, had the Americans not maneuvered, it would have been possible that some of the surface vessels would have engaged the Americans in a surface engagement, which would have been disastrous for the Americans, because while the Americans had won the carrier action thanks to the Pearl Harbor attack, the American battle fleet was nowhere to be found, and the American carriers were mainly some heavy cruisers and destroyers. So you basically would have had a task force Taffy engagement, the famous engagement that took place during the Battle of the Philippine Sea, when Japanese battleships engaged American destroyers and escort carriers defending the American landing beaches at Leyte Gulf. You potentially could have had something like that, a task force Taffy situation, with the Japanese surface fleet, with the Yamato included, and a vastly superior surface fleet, could have engaged the American carriers, which would have been potentially disastrous and undermined the victory at Midway. But alas, it did not happen. The fleets did not engage at night, and the following day, Yamato did issue orders to withdraw. It's interesting that the American carrier fleets also withdrew. With the loss of the Yorktown, which was sunk, and the destruction of the Japanese carrier fleet, There was no seeming benefit to keep the American carriers around. Midway wasn't terribly important to them, and I guess, maybe the Americans thought, oh, the Japanese are going to withdraw now that they've lost their principal surface fleet, and they'd be at the mercy of at least the land-based bombers. But either way, they didn't want to risk turning what had seemingly, there were certain limitations of fog of war, but it certainly been a victory to the Americans. They didn't want to risk turning that into a defeat if they had kept their ships around too long, only to be engaged by a vastly superior surface fleet. So it's interesting. I'm trying to remember where it was going with that, and I honestly can't. This is going to be a glorious video as I ramble through, 20 or 30 minutes. But hopefully you guys enjoy it. There was certainly some historical commentary here in the first 5 minutes. But anyway, trying to get a little bit back on topic here, we can see that we're about 14 turns in out of a 30-turn game, and we can see the American fleet is clearly withdrawing. Second turn in a row that the ships are pulling back toward the east side of the map, where there's probably a withdrawal point where they can pull their units out. Hopefully we can destroy some of these before they're able to get off the map and meet our objective of destroying at least 10 enemy warships. I guess we'll see. But we're going to have to send the carrier planes out against them. Unfortunately, the one thing is in this game, and I know we've talked about it before, oh, wow, that torpedo bomber just strafed that cruiser to death. One of the annoying things about the game, although I don't know if it's realistic, but it's certainly a factor that you have to consider when you talk about this game, is that torpedo bombers are only able to attack once every 3 turns. So you can destroy 4, maybe even 5 hit points on an enemy ship with torpedoes. They have a much greater impact on an enemy warship. So there's a trade-off between getting that bigger upfront hit with a torpedo, but then having to wait 3 turns, whereas dive bombers usually only do 1 or 2 damage, but they can drop a bomb every single turn. So you can either bomb every turn for between 3 to 6 hit points of damage against a heavy warship over 3 turns, or you can launch a torpedo to destroy 4 or 5 hit points in 1 turn, but then only be able to strafe. And obviously machine gun bullets against armored siding of warships doesn't do a great job. So it's an interesting trade-off. It's not terribly historically accurate, because obviously a plane that dropped a bomb couldn't just keep dropping it. It had to go back to the carrier and rearm. Same deal for the torpedo bombers. But there's an interesting element to the game in that you kind of have to have that trade-off. It's certainly a video game moment, but it's a well-positioned one, I would say, as far as the game's concerned. You can see here we're moving our surface fleet in, our landing fleet in, to land some troops on the Midway Islands. I'll be honest, I didn't know Midway was 2 islands, but it does appear to be an eastern and a western island, the western island having the radar installation and the eastern island having the runway. From my own knowledge of Midway, when you look at the island that has the runway on it, it takes up almost the entire island. It's not quite as dramatic as Wake Island, but it's basically just an island airstrip in the middle of the ocean. And the map here appears to do the same to it as is reality, which is good. It does it some justice here. So mainly at this point, I'm moving my carriers in from the west to close the distance so our bombers can cover the eastern part of the map more easily. While my landing forces move in toward the island, it doesn't look like there's too much of a land force that may pose any kind of serious threats to our landing. We've got several units here, and the islands are so small that I can't imagine they would host much in the way of land forces. Further, one of the islands, we can see the entire thing, and the only thing that's there is a radar installation. So I think there's 2 main questions. One is destroying as much of this American fleet as I can before it retreats, and it's retreating rather rapidly. And the other factor is taking the actual island of Midway, which at this point looks like it'll be a pretty straightforward exercise. In fact, I wonder if there's much point in running this video out to its conclusion. I should have had a historical topic or discussion to have lined up and ready for this video, but to be honest, I didn't. We'll see if I'm able to destroy enough of the American fleet in order to rack up the 10 required kills to get that secondary bonus. Um, but outside of that, things seem pretty straightforward, and hopefully, I'm hoping anyway that they're pretty simple as far as this is concerned. I'd like to just take Midway and move on, but I guess we'll see what happens. I'm curious what the next scenario is. Midway is an interesting um, convergence point, I guess you could say, for the Pacific War, because Midway, if you're playing on the Japanese side anyway, Midway is about that point where video game reality has to start diverging with actual reality. If you're intending to get a realistic look at a World War II scenario. And what I mean by that is that, up until Midway, you can play as the Japanese, and you're kind of the front runner. You can be that ultimate overpowering force and just wipe out everything in your path. And everything's relatively realistic, relatively kosher at that point. It mirrors history as you go through, the Philippines campaign, as you go through the campaign to take Singapore, which, I'll be honest, that's one thing in this game that I'm fairly disappointed, is that the game really doesn't deal with the Malay campaign. The Java campaign, yeah, it's included, but it doesn't include the advance on Singapore, which is interesting, because, my numbers may be wrong here, so please, I know there's a lot of people out there who are very into history, just like myself, but probably know more specifically about the Malay campaign. But it was a disaster for the British. Something like over 60,000 throughout various different battles, and most notably Singapore at the end. But over 60,000 Commonwealth forces, the British and their colonial partners, if you will, were taken prisoner during the drive on Singapore and then the subsequent surrender of Singapore. It was one of the most devastating defeats in the entire history of the British Empire, or Britain before or after the Empire. And yet the game doesn't cover it. And that's a little bit frustrating. I mean, you'd think that triumphant of a march, that successful of a campaign, you'd want to represent it in a game that's looking at, putting you in command of at least in this campaign, of the Japanese forces as they march forward on their conquest. Going back to what I was talking about before, Midway is, again, a divergence point. It's where you can, as a video game, if you want to play a video game, video games traditionally are going to give the player the ability to steamroll their opponent. Maybe they're difficult, maybe they're challenging to the player, but if you win, it's not realistic to say, you won this battle, now let's put you in a scenario where you're worse off than you were before. And what I mean by that is, it's not realistic for a player in a game to win the Battle of Normandy as the Germans and say, congratulations, you wiped out the American landing force. Oh crap, they're advancing on Paris. That's not a realistic outcome. You can't win a decisive. You can have a marginal victory. You can set the victory conditions up so that marginal is just, hold your lines and delay their advance. But a major victory you can't set up that way. So games like Panzer Corps, where they have this extended campaign and you fight throughout the entire, and this isn't a scenario where like you win Normandy and then you have further operations against you in Europe. I haven't played that far in Panzer Corps, so I'm not sure how it handles it, if it even covers that. But my point is that Midway is that point where, Panzer General had it as well, where there's these points where if you win a major victory, then things kind of have to start going off the rails. You win a major victory in the invasion of Russia, you overwhelm and you overthrow the Russians, and now what? You didn't take Britain like happened historically, but now Russia's out of the picture, so then what? And you've got to start throwing in these kind of unusual scenarios that have very little plausibility in terms of reality. And again, Midway's that divergence point, and I don't know what's coming next, but you would think that if you win a decisive victory, at Midway. At that point, is it like, well, what's the next scenario? Is Hawaii the next scenario? Do you go and invade Hawaii? Because that never even came close to happening. I mean, I suppose you could do it, but it would certainly be ahistorical. The other alternative is you go to Guadalcanal, but if you win a decisive victory at Midway, does it really lead to Guadalcanal? If the American carriers are wiped out and their cruiser force is decimated, are they able to resist at Guadalcanal? Are they able to land troops and, support the invasion adequately at Guadalcanal? It really poses some interesting questions, and I guess, this is 5 minutes of me rambling about something that we'll find out after this battle, I'm sure. And I apologize for the rambling. I'll be honest, at this point you can see we've landed troops on the western island, and we took that over. We'll land troops here on the eastern island here in just a moment, I'm sure, and we'll take that island over. And again, the American fleet is withdrawn to the east. It seems like they're mostly all off the map at this point, so I'm not sure what else to talk about, guys. I didn't have a specific topic in mind when I started recording this video. I was just kind of playing out and seeing as things go. But one thing is for certain: when you win as Japan at Midway and you win early, without too much resistance, as happened here, it get boring pretty quick. But again, as far as a scenario design perspective, Midway is interesting to me. It's very much like France in 1940 and Panzer General. If you win that absolutely decisively, then the player expects the opportunity to invade Britain. Or when you invade Russia and win Barbarossa decisively, the player expects that to mean something more than what happened historically. And that's really where Midway comes into play, because you can win the Philippines decisively and it doesn't change the tactical situation all that much, if you're comparing it to what happened historically. Sure, things fall into place quicker, but, it's not like you jump from the Philippines to Washington. And then you can win, the Java Sea. Again, the same scenario. You can win that early, you can win that fast, but it doesn't really fundamentally change the makeup of the war. You could argue historically Japan accomplished a major victory in the Java Sea, at least in terms of video game. And you can see, unfortunately, it looks like the American fleet is getting away. Our dive bombers and torpedo bombers, conveniently for them, started running low on fuel right as they were withdrawing, which is frustrating because, if that hadn't happened, we probably would have destroyed a lot more of them, but it is what it is. We've got to deal with it. But anyway, where was I? But anyway, it does look like the bulk of the American fleet here is going to escape, if not this turn, then the next turn, before we're able to finish them off. And that is quite unfortunate. It looks like we've destroyed 8 of 10 enemy warships. Maybe we'll get one more before it's all said and done, but, more or less, we're probably going to fall just short of our target in terms of kills. I will say at this point, I'm not quite sure what to do with the game. I mean, obviously we still need to take the other island on Midway, but that should happen in the next turn. And then after that point, maybe the game will end. If it does, then great. Normally they end early, but okay, there you go. So we've taken Midway. The special event news report comes up on the screen. And we've destroyed the American carrier fleet, and the remainder of the American fleet is withdrawing. So really, I'm not sure what I'm supposed to do. I figured the battle would have ended at this point, but it obviously hasn't, and we're continuing to fight on. I don't want to make you guys watch 11 turns of nothing important happening, so I may cut out part of this video. I haven't done that in the series previously, but maybe 5-10 minutes, depending on what is necessary in order to seal the deal and win the victory. So given the fact that I did say that, why don't we go ahead and do that here real quick. I'm just going to jump ahead a bit and see, maybe we'll stop at an interesting point. Okay, so We jumped ahead to a theoretically interesting point here, several turns in the future. The American fleet doesn't appear to remain on the map. There's a few submarines that we're trying to hunt and destroy, but despite the defeat of their carrier fleet, the rest of the fleet has moved off, and the game has not given us a decisive victory, which is a bit frustrating. But it is what it is, and we've just got to go ahead and deal with that. We have destroyed the bulk of the American air units that remained. You can see there we just finished off an American B-17 formation that was still on the map. And other than that, we've got our recon planes all over in the map, and we're not detecting anything. So the only reason I can think of the battle continuing at this point is the American submarines that are hidden and lurking somewhere on this map. They have occasionally popped up and given us a little bit of a trouble, just, the occasional odds and end casualty or whatnot, but it's still a bit of a nuisance. You can see here, it looks like our secondary primary objective isn't met, and that's, I don't even remember, from like literally 5 seconds ago. So, yeah. With the scenario running down, I do just want to kind of fall back on the tried and true YouTube comments and just thank everyone for continuing to tune in. I sure hope this is a victory, and we'll find out here momentarily. But thanks again for continuing to tune in, for continuing to support the channel, and all the other things you do here. I really appreciate it. I do mean that from the depths of my soul. I will say that I'm not sure what comes next here, and I apologize. This video was not nearly as well organized as I like. I do ad-lib quite a bit in my videos, and I don't really script anything, but I do tend to go in with some kind of an agenda of what I want to talk about, and to be honest, in this case, I really wasn't sure. In this case, the American air fleet and the fleet itself had already been destroyed, so it was really more or less a mopping up operation in its entirety. And there you can see we had a victory. So it looks like the Americans, part of their fleet was able to limp back, but for the most part we obtained a victory, and it gave us a victory. So you can see here the next scenario is going to be, well, we need to pick either the Super Essentia or the high-powered aircraft engines. I'm going to go with the high-powered aircraft engines for kind of our unique trait. Having better tanks at Japan would be useful to some extent, but for the most part these campaigns are very heavily dependent upon air superiority, and there's not a ton of armor in the Pacific War. So that's why we went with the air unit here. You can see the next turn is the Solomon Islands or Guadalcanal. So despite the victory at Midway, we will be jumping into the Guadalcanal campaign. But until next time, guys, thanks for watching. This is the Historical Gamer signing